Welcome back to the Broadman Word, and we are wrapping up the breakdown of the fiery furnace today. So, if you would turn to Daniel chapter 3, we are going to look at the end of that chapter. So, starting in verse 19. Now, before we do, though, the decree has been met. Or the statue has been built by King Nebuchadnezzar. The decree has been sent out that everybody at the sound of the music is supposed to kneel down before the statue. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do not, even in the face of, well, death. And so that is exactly what they are to face here with the rest of the fiery furnace. Verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. Now, here, what's interesting is the expression that changes with Nebuchadnezzar. Before, it was probably disappointment, upset at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but he allows them to explain, and he wants to know why they're not bowing down. Well, they give their answer, which is very straightforward, and that makes him go into not just being upset, but a fury, as it is called in verse 19. So clearly, it is very personal to King Nebuchadnezzar, which is why I think the statue that he built was of himself. It wasn't just a random golden statue, it was probably a depiction of himself. And so, therefore, he orders that the furnace is heated 7 times more than was usually heated. Now, clearly, when you have a furnace, it is heated hundreds of degrees. And so if you multiply that 7 times, it is just a massive amount. But why pick seven? Again, with the Bible, there are some numbers that have a lot of meaning to it. Here, with the number seven, it means completeness. Now, do I believe that he actually meant 7 times the amount? Yes. I think he actually meant that number. But I also think is giving off the idea I want it as hot as it can be, as completely hot as it can be. I want these 3 men to be completely burned alive. And so that is what he ordered. Verse 20. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. And with these mighty men, these are soldiers, these are trained soldiers, they are not slouches at all. Verse 21. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. What's interesting about that in verse 21 is the mention of all these things that they are wearing: cloaks, tunics, hats, other garments. Why put that in there? Well, I think for me, it's to make the burning happen even faster than it would normally. Don't get me wrong, the temperature of the furnace, especially 7 times the normal amount, would still burn them alive incredibly fast. But I think it is just Nebuchadnezzar showing his fury. I want nothing to survive of these 3 men. I want the memory of them wiped out. I think that's kind of what we're seeing here in verse 21. But it's interesting because instead something else happens. Verse 22. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. So, because of his fury, and obviously, if you told the king, look, king, we will happily get it hotter for you, but it needs time to ramp up to that heat. Um, you don't want to go to a king that is furious and ask of him that request because you could be next. I mean, seriously, you could be next, thrown into the furnace if you say, well, king, we just need just a little bit of time to get to that point of temperature. So, no, of course they don't ask him that, so they just go and do it. But the problem is that's too much heat too quickly and it overheats. Um, Now, a lot of the times when we talk about overheating today, there are a lot of uh, backup things that are put into play that then turn the heat off when it's becoming overheated. Here, in this day and age, there are no backup plans. There are no insurance pieces or valves or whatever it might be. That is not part of the plan. There is nothing like that. And so instead, the flame of the fire kills the men, the soldiers, the trained soldiers who were probably wearing really heavy duty armor at the time as well. They are killed by the flame of the fire. So as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are bound with all these clothes that are meant to catch fire easily, as they are thrown into the fire and are not being burned as they are being thrown into the fire, the men that are throwing them into the fire, which are trained soldiers, very good physique, they are wearing armor, which is probably going to be a little bit less flammable than, well, cloaks and tunics, and yet they are the ones that are burned alive in front of the furnace. Um, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, don't get me wrong, they're still very, even though they survived just being thrown into the furnace, they are still in the furnace with all those flammable objects on them, and they are bound as well. So they have no hope for escape. Well, until God steps in. Verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. He answered and said, but I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Now, this is interesting. So there's a couple of things here. Obviously, he sees that there are 4 beings, 4 humans in the fiery furnace. They are unbound, and so therefore Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their bonds are gone. Their bounds are gone. Their bonds. Their bonds are gone. But the clothes that they have, that they were put on them before they were thrown in, are still on them. Um, and they are just walking around in the midst of the fire. They are not hurt. But there's this 4th individual that is described by Nebuchadnezzar, and he is described as like a son of the gods. Now, what does this mean exactly? This is what could be described as a Christophany, a sighting of Jesus before he comes through the immaculate, through the conception with Mary, the wonderful nativity scene that we have talked about before on the Broadman Word. And so you have this just 4th person walking around. Do I believe that it is Jesus in there? Yes, I do. I believe that this is a moment where the Son of God shows up, and it's interesting because he's not described as he's described as 4 men unbound. He's part of that. But he's also described like a son of the God. So there has to be some reflection of glory that he is giving. Um, and I think Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego um, show that a little bit when it comes to when they are released. They are described as servants of the Most High God by Nebuchadnezzar in verse 26. But I think for me, though, this is a clear example of the Son of God showing up before he takes the form of Jesus, before his birth. I think this is the Son of God appearing to not just Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but to Nebuchadnezzar as well. Now, could it be an angel? Yes, it definitely could be an angel. Um, the angels can definitely take human form. So I'm not saying that it is for certain, 100% for certain, that it is a Christophany, that it is a sighting of the Son of God before the time of Jesus. But based off what we see here, I think that that is certainly a possibility. So it could be either an angel or it could be the Son of God himself, who has come to be with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Nebuchadnezzar sees him. But what's interesting, as soon as they come out of the fire, that fourth individual is no longer there. So let's look at that. Verse 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace, which again is 7 times hotter, so you don't get too close. He declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God. Interesting interesting description there. Come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Now, let's break that down for a second. So, not only do you have no burning flesh, you don't even have the smell of not just burning flesh, but no smell of fire upon them. That is the craziest. Well, obviously, the craziest part of this miracle is that the Son of God shows up in their midst. The second person of the Trinity. But you also have this miracle of no smell of fire being on them. What a moment. I mean, just they must have been completely amazed and confused. And so then you have this speech given by Nebuchadnezzar here in verse 28. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command, and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So you have this declaration of the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, is it possible that Nebuchadnezzar did not make the connection between the God that helped reveal the dream and its interpretation to Daniel in Daniel chapter 2? Is it possible that he just failed to make the connection between the God of Daniel and the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Maybe, possibly, but I don't think so. I think he most likely knew of the connection between Daniel and these three men. So it probably was common assumption or just common knowledge in the court that these four men all worshiped the same God. So my guess is that's probably not a good excuse for the thing that happens a lot in the book of Daniel, especially with King Nebuchadnezzar. He just seems to forget who God is. Like he's been shown time and time again about the greatness of God, and yet he just forgets about him. Now, in a polytheistic culture at that time, that probably would have been very easy to do, to forget about one God because there are so many other gods. But here, he has been given time after time to just be in all of who God is. of who the true God is, and yet he seems to just forget about it. We're going to be looking at that next week as well, when we're seeing the second dream of Nebuchadnezzar, and he doesn't go immediately to Daniel. It's almost like, again, that he forgets who God is. And so we will get into that next week, though. But yeah, he talks here about the Lord and the faith of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He does also describe that it is an angel that is sent by God to deliver his servants. Again, could it be an angel? Absolutely. But could it be a Christophany? Absolutely. So that's something that we aren't told specifically in the passage. Hey, this is a specific example of the Son of God showing up before the time of before he took the form and person of Jesus on earth. Could it be that? Absolutely. Could it be an angel? Absolutely. But either way is a remarkable showing of God's great power and his faithfulness to those that are faithful to him. I mean, we see that, just an awesome way of putting it, by the way. In verse 28, who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. It is a beautiful testament to the faithfulness of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which goes great with the rest of the theme of this book, the faithfulness of Daniel. So this idea of faithfulness is not just for Daniel, but for these three men as well. And that's really, really cool to see. And of course, they are rewarded with that, not just for not burning up, but they're also rewarded by having this decree of, look, this God of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego should be celebrated, should be honored. Now, granted, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't get the point that he's the only God. But verse 30, he also promotes these three men in a monetarily and functionary way as well. So for you and I, the fiery furnace, what does it really have to do? Because we are, Lord willing, we are not being pushed into a fiery furnace. Hopefully, that does not happen to you. But what does this passage have to do with you and I? And again, I think it all has to go down to the idea of faithfulness to God. Even in the midst of these times where it would be very easy to go with the crowd and to uh, not bend the knee. It is very, very easy to just go with them, but instead we should absolutely stand firm in our beliefs. We saw that in the first part of the fiery furnace. We see now the rewards of that faithfulness. But here's the interesting part. If Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had burned up in the fiery furnace, they would still be rewarded by being in heaven. That's the greatest reward of all, by spending an eternity with your Lord and Savior. And so, even if that was the case, it's not like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego got a bad deal if they did burn up in the fiery furnace. They stood firm in their beliefs all the way until the end, and now they are resting in eternity with their Lord. Now, obviously, that did not happen. They were told, look, or they were shown, or who knows what the fourth person, whether it was the angel or the Christophany, who knows what they said who knows what that person said to the three men. It's like, look, your time isn't here yet. We aren't told what they said or if they said anything at all, but they were not burned up. And so, therefore, the reward for them was continuing to be witnesses for the Lord, no matter the situation. And so, that for you and I is the real takeaway from the fiery furnace. Whether we are being stared at through physical torment, or just emotional torment, or just difficult life circumstances, stand firm in your faith no matter the outcome, whether it goes according to what you hoped for or what you think. And stand firm in your faith of the Lord, and you will be rewarded in one way or the other, but all according to the Lord's will and His timing. So, with that, I know it was a little bit long, but the fiery furnace is one of the great passages in Scripture, and I wanted to give it justice. So, with that being said, thanks for spending some time with me with Brown Word today. I will see you next week as we dive into the second dream of Nebuchadnezzar and going back to the life of Daniel. I will see you then. Thanks.